This happened when I was 12 years old. I used to have this little electric mini bike that went about 20 or so miles per hour and had a small little light on the front of it, so I could see in the dark. I used it to get to my friend's house and back. On one particular summer night, I drove over to a friend's house on my mini bike at around 5 or 6 p.m. to play with him on his Xbox 360. I believe we play Call of Duty 4 or World War. I'm not sure which one we played. All I know is that I stayed there till around 9 at night, and since my parents were easygoing parents and we lived about 2 miles away, they didn't mind that I stayed home late. When I went outside of my friend's house after I say goodbye to him, I went to go on my mini bike to drive back home. Keep in mind, the whole way there, around his house of mine too, are largely wooded areas, so we would always hear creatures moving around and always hear crickets when I hopped on my bike, and I happened to notice I didn't hear anything at all. Not even any crickets, it was just silence. This was a very odd, because we always hear them, and there are thousands of them in the woods. There was something that made them quiet. Take note that the mini bike was electric and didn't make much sound when it accelerated. Since it was summer, and pretty early in the summer, around mid-July, it was still pretty light out at 9 p.m. Not too light, but enough to make out someone's face from about 10 to 15 yards away. As I started heading home, I felt very uneasy, as if I was being watched, and I still heard nothing of the crickets. I was coming up at a T-junction, where I would have to turn left to continue down the road for about a half-mile, and make another left at an intersection and going down straight until my house came up. As I was approaching the T-junction, I could barely make out something in the tree straight ahead of me. I saw a pair of eyes in the trees. My first instinct was thinking it was maybe an owl or something, because we got quite a few owls up here where we live, until I saw I had blood-red eyes. When I got closer, I could tell whatever the fuck that thing was not an owl, and his eyes were 9 feet off the ground. Before I go on, I must say there's a legend around where I lived at night. Sasquatch would come out and hunt, which was obvious, or so I thought. Bullshit. I never believed in Bigfoot cryptids, but when I saw these eyes and how far off the ground they were, I immediately thought of this legend. I pissed my pants when I saw this because I was a very paranoid person at the time and still am, and would always assume the worst. I was terrified and knew that I would have to make this T-junction very fast and book it the fuck home. When I turned left, I was going as fast as I could on that mini bike. I lost sight of the eyes and thought thing had just ran off. Until I heard the woods, but whatever this thing was easily keeping pace with me. I started crying at this point and kept just driving as fast as I could down the road. I started approaching the intersection when the tree stopped and there would be a bit of a clearing on all sides of it, and saw 9 and a 2-foot, tall, hairy, disgusting-looking bees come out of the freaking woods. It was coming straight for me. I made the left as fast as I could, and I'm not sure if it was a miracle, but I saw a pair of headlights coming down the road. I turned behind me and saw the beast step into the woods because it would be illuminated by this person's headlights. As soon as I passed the person, I heard the crickets again, and hoped that this beast would just leave me alone. When I got home, I shut the garage door, locked every door, window in the house, and my mom saw me obviously uneasy and pale and asked what was wrong. I never told her, or anyone for that matter. Not up until now. I don't know what the thing was. Possibly a Sasquatch, but whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. I've since moved into a dorm at my college and settled visit my parents, who still live where they did when I was 12. I hope no one ever has to endure the fear that I felt that night. This is a true account of something strange that happened to me and 2 friends one summer in the early 2000s. It happened in the town that I grew up in, with one of the friends being a lifelong friend from childhood and the other a college friend of his. We had gone to different schools, and being home for the summer, we were just having a lot of fun partying and whatnot. This particular night, I got together with my friend James and his friend Mark. It was a hot night, and we decided to jump the fence to our own town pool and go swimming. We had done this a dozen times before and have never had any trouble and only ever needed to keep an eye out on local cops. We got there, hopped the fence and stargaze on top of the canopies, and then we went swimming. We weren't that loud as we didn't want to attract any attention of any cops through looking for kids. About an hour into being there, all of us in the pool, we heard a low grumble come from the woods that surrounded the pool on three sides. It rose quickly intensity and volume with a rapid Doppler effect that came towards us from deep in the woods. It sounded like a pack of very angry dogs or wolves or something all roaring ever louder, like talking over one another. We all froze at the beginning of it and just stared into the woods at the direction of the sound. It came so fast, charging to the tree line and the chain link fence that surrounds the pool grounds. I've never been so frightened in my life. The thing I can remember clearly was there were no sounds of footballs, whatever it was, moved to the woods at such a rapid speed, but no discernible thumps or branches being crushed underfoot or branches or anything being moved. The awful roaring reached a crescendo just as it broke the tree line and got to the fence. Or, so our ears told us because we couldn't see anything there. We all remained frozen in the pool, just staring and waiting for our death. I really don't know how long we stayed motionless in the pool staring, but the sound stopped abruptly when it got to the end of the grounds. It was such an awful, heart-chilling sound. It made her bum run cold on a hot summer night. After God knows how long, we all snapped out of it and got out of the pool. We hauled ourselves out, grabbed her clothes and ran dripping wet and jumped the fence and took off. Now, the thing is, this is the suburbs, only about 20 minutes outside of New York City, so there are no bears, no wolves, and I've never seen a dog without a master, much less a pack of wild dogs out there. This was one of the most frightening moments of my life. I have no idea what it was. I actually completely forgot about the incident to a few years ago when my friend James brought it up, and the entire thing came flooding back at once. The only thing I can compare the sound to is one on a Bigfoot documentary, where I saw a man who said that he heard one mimic the sound of this. That's the closest I've heard, being that it is the suburbs outside a very densely packed city, and knowing the size of the woods, I find it near impossible for it to be that. These woods are not large enough at all to sustain something like that. It's bordered by schools, businesses, and houses. So I don't really know what it was after all this time. I asked my friend about it again 2 Christmases ago, and he said he thought it was aliens. I haven't spoken to Mark, as he was more of my friend's friend, but I'm now curious what he thinks after all this time. I am a 20-year-old male. I live in the lower half of Oklahoma, about an hour away from Oklahoma City. I work at a fast food restaurant with a very high turnover rates. So needless to say, I've met and talked to several interesting and odd people we've hired. However, I've always been very personable and love getting to know people by asking them questions they may not normally be asked. One day, Jesse and I were both off and began talking about the supernatural, and how even though I'm a skeptic, I still love hearing people's stories. When out of nowhere he gets really serious, his face goes slightly pale, and he says, "I have a story." By his sudden change in mood, I could tell he was serious. He was usually such a bubbly guy. Jesse said it happened like this. One day, Jesse and his friend, let's call him Phil, were skipping school, as rambunctious kids do, in the same area we now work in. Phil's father owned several properties, but had one in particular that was never really used much. It was a plot of land with maybe around 30 acres, mostly just spares trees and grass. But the thing about this property was that it had a house on it, one of those old, maybe 50s or 60s houses that looked like the people had just up and left one day with no reason or belongings. They just left being bored and not of anything else to do in real Oklahoma. They thought it would be a good idea to go explore. It was about 3 in the afternoon in a bright and sunny day, traveling down the dirt road to the house. Arriving there shortly, they got out of their truck and walked the path leading to the house, moving the gate as they answered. The house itself was a 2-story old country-style house with a big porch and a somewhat sizable living room. As it seemed, they both walked up the creaky porch, each step letting out a crackly sound as they moved. Phil decided to go explore the inside, while Jesse elected to explore the outside and porch. Phil went inside, leaving the barely hinged door open, while Jesse looked around. Exploring the porch, he found nothing of interest, so hopped off the porch and began walking around the side. As he did, he said he began to hear some sort of heavy breathing and heavy footsteps. Thinking it was only Phil, Jesse continued around the house. Now halfway around the large house, when he suddenly heard the loudest shrieking sound he'd ever heard. He froze. Phil's father never used this land, let alone for livestock. Why would there be a goat out here? Before Jesse could move, a figure slowly walked from around the corner. It was tall, 6'8" or taller, and very lean and buff, he said. He nervously looked up at its head only to find a more off-putting sight. A goat's head sat on top of a muscular torso, looming down on him and very obviously looking at him. Jesse snapped out of it and bolted back towards the path they came from, screaming the whole way. Phil, hearing this, ran out of the house yelling, What is it?" when he too must have noticed the figure, now closer to the porch, just staring at him. Phil took off to catching up to Jesse, passing and tripping Jesse. No joke, tripping Jesse in hopes of a better chance of survival maybe. Jesse, shaken but not hurt, got back up to continue running, but not before one last look back at that house. All he saw was the goat man, now standing in front of the house, just watching them leave, motionless. They both got to the truck fine, Jesse rightly ticked off by being tripped by his friend, and they hightailed it out of there. The moral of the story: don't trespass on Goat Man's property, and if you do, make sure you're faster than your so-called friends. I deliver for a local pizza chain in southern Ohio. It's in a rather small city with lots of farmland and heavily wooded roads. So you can imagine I have seen a few odd and unexplainable things while driving around during the night. I have seen strange orange lights in the sky. I shine from animals peeking out from storm drains. Something that looked to be the tail of a large reptile disappearing off the side of the road. A strange green orb hover above some trees. However, the creepiest and most unnerving experience I've had happened late one night while I was driving down one of those long wooded roads, having to use my brights because there are no street lights for several miles, when I got a strange feeling that I wasn't alone this time. I started to look around and noticed something to my left in the trees. There was a pair of bright red glowing eyes about 5 or 6 feet above the ground, staring right at me. I immediately slowed down to do a double take, and then another and another, as these eyes watched me slowly drive by. My heart and mind were racing as I began trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was a mailbox reflector, but there were no houses there, or maybe brake lights on a car, but that did not make sense either, since there was nothing there but trees. I even went as far as thinking maybe someone had hung something in the trees as a joke. But they were gone when I came back. Once I had passed and I could no longer see whatever it was that was watching me, I began looking for road signs to use as markers for when I returned back down the road after I had delivered the pizza. Well, on my way back down the road, I drove carefully and slowly looking for the spot of my encounter. I started to slow down as soon as I saw the road signs and began to scan the tree line with the camera on my phone, ready to snap a picture of anything I saw. But there was nothing there. It was gone. Ever since that night, I've been up and down that road countless times, and I've never seen those eyes again or anything else in that spot. I thought it must have been an animal of some kind, if nothing else. But when I did some minor research into different animals who have eyes that glow red, there were none living in the area. I have asked around and believe it was most likely the Mothman, but I have no idea why it would reveal itself to me. I may never know. I still frequent this eerie road as well as many others on my routes. I will be getting a dash cam because most of the time when I'm on these roads, I feel as if I'm being watched, and I would love to catch something on camera to have as proof, other than just my word. I've seen quite a few things that I have a hard time explaining. My father served in the military, was descended from a Native American tribe from up north, was a survivalist and a complete sociopath that forced his sons into intense survival scenarios and then left us for weeks on end to see if we'd survive. I've seen some truly disturbing things during these cramping trips, and some things in less stressful settings. Anyways, I'll get on with the sighting. I was 11. I had just moved back to America less than a week before. My family had decided to take a short road trip up to Maine to visit some family when we went off course, being 11 and naive enough to think that I would actually make it to Maine before my father. Did anything stupid. I didn't pay attention to when he pulled off onto a back road. To this day, I do not know where I was dropped off at, just that it was in a dense, forested area. I think it was in New York, but I can't say for certain. I was kicked out of the car, handed my canteen, my bow, my compass, and my quiver. I was told that they'd be back after visiting family, and I'd have 15 days out here. I did the basic survival stuff. Found drinkable water, built shelter, plotted out a rough map of the area in my head, and all of that stuff. It was my third or fourth night there when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Since mountain lions didn't come out this far east, and bears were easy to scare away if it was one, I figured that I'd go investigate, in case that it was an injured hiker or something. After following the sound, all that I could find was a squirrel that was partially eaten. Since the screaming had stopped, I figured that someone had been hiking and came across those, but had left their calming down. So I went back to my shelter and settled in for the night. After that, though, the screaming became a nightly occurrence, and after the third night of not finding anything aside from evidence of a predator in the area, I decided to play it safe and stay in my shelter at night. 2 days before my family would pick me up where I was, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming right outside my shelter. I jumped out with bone hand, my knife and arrow in the other. What I saw terrified me. It was about the size of a dog, but shaped like a deer, had a very humanoid face, and was covered in dark scales. I panicked and shot in the chest. It began hissing and wheezing as it ran off into the trees. I had thought about following it and killing it, but then I looked at his tracks. I saw something that convinced me otherwise. The creature's hind legs left behind the tracks of a small deer. The front legs, however, you see a person walking on their hands like a gorilla. Only the fingers ended with sharp claws, marks scratching up the earth while it moved. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, and on the following morning, I dug several holes around my camp, filled them with sharpened stakes, and covered them. I also did my squirrel hunting and harvested berries as fast as I could once my defenses were up, so that I wouldn't need to worry about losing my strength if that thing came back. It didn't that night. Not that I got any sleep anyway. In the morning, I just carved a simple warning into the trees around my camp that said danger traps, and left. I didn't let go of my bow until after I was picked up, and we have been driving for an hour. I honestly don't know what I saw, or if the light had been playing tricks on me. I just know that I heard a screaming sound, and that I know what I saw in the creature's tracks. Well, to begin, I get my Native American blood from my mother's side. Her mother was a full-blooded Chippewa, although they didn't talk much about it, so I sought out elders when I was in my early 20s. When I was about 12 years old, my mom and dad got divorced, and we moved to Florida, where my mother's half-sisters lived. While visiting my Aunt Caroline, who lived in a little town called Osprey, 15 miles outside of Sarasota, which is on the western coast of Florida, South Tampa, is where I saw a skunk ape. My mom and aunt were talking, so I decided to walk through the nature because I love it. I headed for a wooded area. I had to cross a cow pasture to get to the woods. About halfway across the pasture is when I saw this hairy man. It was standing next to a palmetto bush, just staring at me. That is all I remember, because the next thing I know, I'm walking on the street in front of my mom's house. I never told anyone until years later. Again, in my 20s at my dad's house in Michigan, there was a summer of strange events. Something was breathing outside my window, so loud it woke me up out of a sound sleep. My stepmother confided in me that she saw a tall, hairy man run across the backyard at night. My dad had two different events where something was making a high-pitched noise and slapped against the side of the trailer. My uncle, who lived across the street, said one night he heard what sounded like a grown man wrestling in the woods behind the house. During this time, one of my elders had asked my dad if he had a couple of friends who could build a sweat lodge on the 15 acres that my dad owns. My dad said yes. So they came out to do the ceremony. It was a year later, and they hadn't built the lodge, so I went to the elders and asked if something was wrong. One of them said it just didn't feel right. I decided to tell them about my weird experiences, which had stopped after they did the ceremony on my dad's land. They all said that it was Unchi, which meant Bigfoot. They explained, he shows up when things are out of balance to remind people to live in a good way, to restore balance later. I learned about putting down tobacco when entering the woods in their territory and asking permission to pass through. It is said that they will guide you and protect you, and although you will not know they are there usually. The Bigfoot is also known as Kitty Sabe, and is taught that they brought honesty to the people.